Right, our text today is Joshua chapter 4. So the two chapters of the opening chapters of Joshua, chapters 3 and 4, they belong together. Basically, the two chapters describe how the people crossed the Jordan. The river Jordan, we said last week, is the barrier between the wilderness, which is the place of God's punishment, not a place that we want to be at or to linger in, and Canaan, the place of God's promise. So crossing the Jordan is a major milestone in the history of Israel. Now, I don't know how many of you enjoy history, and when you travel, you go and look at the history museums of different countries, and sometimes they have panoramas of their history. And of course, the panoramas will have milestones. And if you don't have much time, you just focus on the milestones. So I suppose Israel, when they present their history, the crossing of the Jordan will definitely occupy a central place. Why? Because the crossing the Jordan marks the end of their wilderness wanderings and the start of a new journey of not just entering the land of Canaan, but claiming God's promised land. So let us quickly recall how Israel managed to cross the Jordan. The river, at that point of time, was at flood stage. In spring, when the waters from the snow up at Mount Hermon melt, they rush down the river and they rush into the Dead Sea. So I hope you can recall that the crossing was achieved by a combination of two key factors. The first key factor, God's leading and power, and the second key factor, the people's faith and obedience. And we said that for amazing things to happen in our lives, in our spiritual growth, we need a combination of these two factors. So firstly, the living God was in full control, taking charge, leading through the movements of the Ark of the Covenant, causing the water of the Jordan to pile up some 30 kilometers upstream. The living God and the God of all the earth. The God of all the earth, all the rivers of the earth belong to the Lord of all the earth. So God is at liberty to command the waters of the river, whether to flow or to stop flowing. So this is our God, and He was in full control at the time of the Jordan crossing. The people's part was no less important. We must remember that. We must remember that for God to accomplish His will, we have to play our part. So the people set out to follow the ark. They focused on the ark, not on the threatening river. And especially the priests carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord, they stepped into the water, and with that first step, the waters upstream heaped up and stopped flowing downstream. And not just that, the priest went to the middle of the river, stood there until the whole nation had completed the crossing. So the lesson we learned there is that when facing the Jordans of our lives, we must have faith. We must have faith that God will make a way. So that was the theme, the topic for last weekend's sermon. God will make a way. There is no water that God cannot part. There is no barrier that God cannot cross. And there is no suffering that God cannot strengthen us to bear. So in every situation that is unknown, and there are many unknowns going forward, there are many situations that are unexpected. And worse still, there are many situations that are unwanted. In all these situations, God is there. He is with us. He is in the midst of His people. So when we face these situations and we face them with faith and obedience to God, we will have the chance We will have the chance to experience God doing the unexplainable. It's not that difficult to explain, and scholars have explained how the river became dry land, etc. Harder to explain the crossing of the Red Sea, but the point is we have the chance to experience God doing the amazing unexplainable. So crossing the flooded Jordan on dry land was totally unexpected, but it allowed the new generation of Israelites to experience that with God, all things are possible. The new generation needed their own experience of this. They needed to experience that God is the God of impossible things. But it doesn't stop there. In chapter 4, Israel is instructed to keep the memory of this amazing event alive for future generations. Now, in today's reading, we're not going to read the whole text all at one go. We're going to read in 3 parts. Firstly, we will read the text from chapter 4, verses 1 to 9. Then we'll move to the next part, and so there are 3 parts. So let's read the first part first. Chapter 4, verses 1 to 9, we'll read together. All right, together. When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight." So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe. He said to them, "Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." So the Israelites did as Joshua commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, as the Lord had told Joshua, and they carried them over with them into their camp, where they put them down. Joshua also set up 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan at the spot where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. This part of the text is about setting up a memorial. Now we know humans are prone to forgetfulness. Pastor Timothy was talking about that, forgetfulness. Well, depending on the situation and to what extent you are forgetful, forgetfulness may be harmless or disastrous. So how many of you on arrival in church at the sanctuary realize you forgot something? Anyone? No one. With tenacity, a few of them forgot. And I knew what they forgot. Their handphones. Forgetfulness may be harmless, but it can be disastrous. Occasionally, I forget to take my medicine. Few times a year. Not too bad. What if I forget to take my medicine all the time? I tell you, I wouldn't be standing here. I've met 1 or 2 people, older people who are very sick, and next to their bed, all the medicine that they have accumulated, they're supposed to take them. They leave them in their packages. That's why they're very, very sick. Forgetfulness can be disastrous. Spiritual forgetfulness. Listen carefully. Spiritual forgetfulness or spiritual amnesia. Spiritual amnesia is disastrous. It's never harmless. What is spiritual amnesia? What is spiritual forgetfulness? Spiritual forgetfulness is when we forget the past faithfulness of God. God has been good to us, God has been faithful to us, He has rescued us, and He has helped us to cross many Jordans, and we forget Him and we forget what He did. Spiritual amnesia or forgetfulness is especially disastrous when we face challenging situations. In a tough situation, when we forget that God is our fortress, God is our guide, God is our good shepherd, He's our anchor, He's our strength. We forget all these things, and that He has always helped us. When at that point we forget God, it will be like in a journey, you are at the top of a slippery slope and you lose your foothold. Either you didn't grab the rail, or your foot gave way, and then you go down the slippery slope. You slide. And from that point, the slope is the slope of fear, anxiety, confusion, and it multiplies until you sink into despair and depression. So you might think, oh, I'm exaggerating it. No. This slide, in fact, can become the start of backsliding, of leaving God altogether. We need reminders of who God is and what He has done. Not just a mental reminder, but always recounting in our lives who God is, what He has done. So after crossing the Jordan, the people needed a lasting reminder of God's leading and God's power at the start of a new journey. Now that they crossed the Jordan, they are going to start a new journey to claim the promised land. This journey is going to be hard and tough, and there will be many slippery slopes along the way. So the people set up 2 monuments of 12 stones each. One of them they set up after they crossed the river, in other words, on the west bank of the Jordan, at a spot which was to be their first camp. This was the first territory in Canaan that they will claim. They are going to claim huge tracts of territory, but this is the first spot. And this place is called Gilgal. Now Gilgal we did not read in the text from verses 1 to 9. We'll read about it later in verse 19. But this is a place called Gilgal. You see it marked on the map. Yes. And at Gilgal they set up their first memorial. A memorial consisting of 12 stones. Then the second monument was set up in the middle of the Jordan. We are told that in verse 9. Marking the spot where the priest stood firm, carrying the ark, while the people crossed on dry land. So there are 2 monuments, one at Gilgal and one, in fact, at the point of the river. And in fact, you read carefully verse 9, it says that Joshua himself set it up. Now you can imagine, the monument in the river is not always visible, because when the river floods, the stones will be covered. But occasionally, when the river is drier, you will see that monument in the water. So I imagine in the future, when the land is settled, the people are all now in peace, the Lord has provided for them, and they are very settled. How would those generations know what God did in the past? Well, maybe they will have school excursions. School excursions to go and view the 2 memorials. Why not? In fact, Israel, their educational system is quite tough. They require before you graduate, by the way, I think they still do it. When I last knew this, they were doing this. Before you graduate from high school, you must solo travel on your own, backpacking from the northernmost part of Israel to the southernmost part. Solo. Girls and boys alike, before you can get your high school diploma. They require that of them, so that people who of the land, they must know the land. And of course, they are in Israel, boys and girls are called up for military service. So the children start with knowing their history. The children will ask, what do these stones mean? So the teacher will explain. They explain what God had done at Gilgal, what God had done. And then they will bus to the river Jordan, which is very nearby, and then they will look, and hopefully they are visiting at a time when part of that monument is visible, and then the teacher will say, this is where it happened. What happened and where it happened? How many of you have seen the statue of Sir Stamford Raffles at the Singapore River? Very good, thank you. The children downstairs, not many of them have seen. So you see some tourists and all stumble upon that statue. Who is this man? What's he doing here? The founding of Singapore. And where? At this spot where he supposedly stepped on shore. The children will know what happened, where it happened. In this way, the spiritual history of Israel will not be forgotten. It will be preserved. Successive generations will remember that the hand of God is powerful. And they'll remember this whenever they face impossible situations. So later, we will take part in the Holy Communion. And we remember Jesus. We do this so often, but it mustn't get stale. Remember Jesus, what he did for us on the cross. And not just to die on the cross for us, but to give us new life. To give us new life. To exchange our sinful old life for the possibility of a new life. A new life lived not to please ourselves. If we live a new life to please ourselves, we have not changed at all. But a life to live for him and with his strength. So there are many remembrances that we ought to keep in our lives. So here is the memorial to remember what God did in taking the people out of the wilderness into Canaan. So now let's look at the second part of our text. The second part of our text, we continue to see the details of the crossing. Because it's not over yet. The people have crossed, but the priests are still standing in the middle of the Jordan. Step out of the Jordan. These were the instructions to the priests. But let's read the text together first. Together. Now the priests who carried the ark remained standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything the Lord had commanded Joshua was done by the people, just as Moses had directed Joshua. The people hurried over, and as soon as all of them had crossed, the ark of the Lord and the priests came to the other side while the people watched. The men of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh crossed over, ready for battle, in front of the Israelites, as Moses had directed them. About 40,000 armed for battle crossed over before the Lord to the plains of Jericho for war. That day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him all the days of his life, just as they had stood in awe of Moses. Then the Lord said to Joshua, command the priests carrying the ark of the covenant law to come up out of the Jordan. So Joshua commanded the priests, come up out of the Jordan. And the priests came up out of the river, carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord. No sooner had they set their feet on the dry ground that the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and ran in flood as before. So now at this point, the people have all completed the crossing. The actions concerning the gathering of the stones, the setting up of the memorial, they've all been carried out. All this while, the priests who carried the ark, they remained standing in the middle of the Jordan. Finally, the instructions are given to Joshua to tell them to step out of the Jordan. And as soon as the priests stepped out of the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan returned to flood stage again. And so you have a very dramatic closing of the miracle of crossing the river Jordan. Finally, the barrier is behind them. And so they have accomplished their first mission. You might say that life is a series of missions. And we have to accomplish each one of them successfully, one by one. So at least for the people, this first mission has been accomplished. In this text, we are going to focus on who obeyed God's instructions. Who obeyed God's instructions? You will notice that, in fact, if you want to sum up all of the book of Joshua, 24 chapters, you will see again and again God's leading and power, the people's faith and obedience. And you're like, oh my goodness, same thing every time. Yes, because these are the most basic lessons to learn in our spiritual walk with God. Who obeyed God's instructions in the text? Firstly, we have the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. These tribes had already been allotted land on the east of the Jordan. All this is in the book of Numbers. In the book of Numbers, we will see this, that Moses already, on their request, gave them land. So you see, Manasseh is only half a tribe, Gad and Reuben. They already been given land on the east, but they agreed with Moses that they would leave their territory, join the other tribes in crossing the Jordan and in helping to conquer the land of Canaan. So these 2.5 tribes were obedient. They kept their promise earlier made to Moses. Of course, at some cost. Some people make promises. When it's time to keep their promise, they chicken out. It's very interesting because the no-show rate at functions, etc., is climbing higher and higher. That's a very bad thing. But these 2.5 tribes, they kept their promise. A representative group of men, not all of them, just not necessary, so to speak, a representative group of 40 of them led the crossing, we read. Yeah? Not just that they led the crossing, they were armed for battle. They will be the first to face the enemies in case they are met by enemies when they cross. So the first group to be obedient, the 2.5 tribes east of the Jordan. Who else was obedient to God? Joshua. We cannot take the obedience of Joshua for granted. We are told in verse 14, as a result of the crossing, Joshua was confirmed before the people as the successor to Moses, and the people revered him. The people respected him all the days of his life. We are going to have, and we've been told this many times over and over, we will have a leadership succession soon. New leaders have to prove themselves. They may get the title, but they still have to prove themselves before the people would respect them. In this matter, Joshua obeyed the Lord fully and courageously, and he did it to exalt the Lord before the people, so that the people will praise God. And because of that, the Lord exalted him. We do not read anywhere in the book of Joshua that Joshua tried to or even did anything to exalt himself. He did not exalt himself. The Lord exalted him. So there is the obedience of the next leader, and there he earned, if you like, that position of succeeding to Moses. Who obeyed the instructions of the Lord? Who else obeyed the instructions of the Lord so that the crossing could be achieved? We have the priests carrying the ark. They stood firm. They remained standing in the middle of the Jordan through the whole crossing, as a symbol of God watching, protecting the people as they hurried across. How many hours did they stand there in obedience to God? You can make a guess. We do not know, but we know it could not have been a short time. It must have been a fairly long time and very, very tough. It is easier, we know that, to be active than to be still. It's easier, in my view, to march across the river than to stand in the middle of the river carrying a load. No? How many of you have taken part in parades? Because you belong to MPCC, NCC, whatever. How many? Hey, national servicemen, surely you have taken part in parades. I can't believe one very enthusiastic one at the back. I'm not surprised. So few of you. Huh? Can't remember. That means your experience wasn't that impactful. I remember all the parades that I take part in, especially that famous parade where we stood in the rain. It is easier to march than to stand at attention on the parade ground waiting for VIP to come and do all the ceremonies. We are so relieved when we get to march off. At one parade, in my younger days, I remember it was very, very hot because the parades were all like afternoon. I fainted. Standing still, fainted. I see stars. So they brought me to the first aid tent, then they revived me, and then I went back to stand. If your children need to do this, don't stop them. Don't say, oh, poor thing, this and that. That's how they get toughened. And then relief to march. In all my parades, I've never seen people faint while marching. Never. But fainting during standing, yes. The point is, it's very hard to be still. It's very hard. If God asks you to be the one to be standing still, it's very difficult. But it has to be done. And I bet you, these people were specially chosen. So I remember in the time when I belonged to a uniform group and I stayed there decades, because I really loved the structure and the discipline of the group. If you were chosen to carry the colours, you are very proud to do it. They can only choose people who don't faint and drop the colours. But how many of us as Christians are like that? How many of us can, so to speak, take the tougher jobs? Don't want everything. So I see dropouts along the way, now that I've been around for so long. Why? It's too tough. We need dogged determination, and we need an attitude of not giving up if we are to obey God and fulfill His purpose for our lives. We're put off by so many little things. So the priests, they have my respect. Because it's very difficult to stand in the middle of the Jordan as instructed by God. 3 groups, 3 persons, types of persons, the 2.5 tribes, Joshua himself, the priests, they obeyed God. And so a combination of their obedience led to a successful crossing of the Jordan. Now we come to the last section of the text. The third and final part of the text, chapter 4, verse 19 to chapter 5, verse 1. Now at this point of the text, we are returning to the main theme of the chapter. The main theme of the chapter is about setting up the memorial so that future generations will not forget what God has done. So this memorial on the West Bank is set up at Gilgal. Gilgal is actually a very important place, and I hope that in future when you study the book of Joshua, when you read of this place being mentioned, you will pay attention and you remember. It is not prominent like Jerusalem, Jericho, but it's a very important place. Why? Because Gilgal was their first base, was the first land that land in Canaan that they claimed. And in fact, Gilgal was the ops center, the operations center for subsequent military campaigns. So you can see that setting up the memorial here at this place was very appropriate. Because each time the army marches out, each time they make plans and they open up all the maps, etc., they will see the memorial that says, the hand of the Lord is powerful. So they will plan and they will do everything in that context that God will give them the victory. Each time the army returns to base, and in the book of Joshua, each time they return, most of the time victorious. But in defeat even, they will be reminded the hand of God is powerful. Every campaign, every battle belongs to God, belongs to the living God. So this is about the setting up of the memorial finally at Gilgal. And the text, let's read first together. On the 10th day of the first month, the people went up from the Jordan and camped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. And Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken out of the Jordan. He said to the Israelites, "In the future, when your descendants ask their parents, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them, 'Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God." Chapter 5 verse 1. Now, when all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, their hearts melted in fear, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. Israel, we are told, set foot in Canaan on the 10th day of the first month, verse 19. Why mention this? What is the significance of this? It is significant because exactly 40 years ago, on the 10th day of the first month, the people of God in Egypt selected a Passover lamb and prepared to eat the first Passover on the 14th day of the month, and then they left Egypt in haste and they crossed the Red Sea 40 years ago. Exodus chapter 12. So the mention of the Red Sea and the coming out of Egypt is very, very critical at this point, because the way Israel was brought out of Egypt is connected to the way Israel was brought into Canaan. The way Israel was brought out of Egypt is connected to the way Israel was brought into Canaan. What is the connection? What is the connection? The connection is the powerful hand of God. The powerful hand of God which brought about the two miraculous crossings. The first one at the Red Sea, 40 years later, the one at the Jordan River. God accomplished his purpose. They have to get out, they have to go in. So you see, the memorial at Gilgal is not just for information. It's not just for information, it is for inspiration. What inspiration? The inspiration of future generations to know what? To know that throughout Israel's history, from the Red Sea to the Jordan River, and of course you can go back from the Red Sea backwards to the time of Abraham, etc., that throughout Israel's history, the hand of the Lord had been powerful. Each generation must stay focused on that. They must focus on the fact that in their spiritual history, what the Lord has done for them. Future generations must stay focused. They must not suffer from spiritual amnesia. They must remember how the hand of God acted powerfully on their behalf. When they do that, they will learn to fear God. When they see these stones and they hear the story, they read maybe a text on the wall, they will learn to fear God. Now, fear of God is sometimes very misunderstood, and we don't like to do that. Fear of God. Fear of God is not being terrified of God. It's not being in dread of God. It's not being terrified. It is to have a profound respect for God. Many things go wrong in our lives because we do not respect God. Fear of God must be cultivated, to have that respect for God, respect for who God is and what He has done. And when we know this, it leads us to being in awe of God. In awe of God, and an awe that leads us to say we can trust this God. We can obey this God because this is who God is. So in this way, all the remembrances, all the remembering will lead Israel to gain courage. They will gain courage while their enemies, Amorites, Canaanites, etc., they will lose courage. Why? Because they say, our opponents, they have the Almighty God on their side. So this is all setting the stage for Israel to flourish in the land. But we know, sadly, that later in their history, Israel did not remember God. And so all the laments of the prophets are about, you have forgotten God. And of course, we know there were disastrous consequences to their spiritual amnesia, including exile from the land. But at this point, in starting off in the land, the stage was set for them to remember God, to cling on to God, and in the toughest moments of their life, to remember the hand of the Lord is powerful. Now let's close. What are the implications for us? Well, we start with memories of God's working in our lives. I'm quite sure in this century, there are many with wonderful memories going back to decades ago. God's wonderful working. The dots connect, so to speak. The wonderful working of God, they build up. Because we have experienced how God has intervened to rescue us, to help us, to right straight on the crooked lines of our lives. You keep a journal, you have some memorials in the house, in your room, maybe in your pockets, in your bags. We gain energy and we grow in our faith when we revisit, when we review the past instances of God's goodness in our life. Now, keeping a journal, writing down things may not suit some of us. Then we will have to find other means to remember. The main thing is to resolve to remember. And those of us growing older and older, well, not just resolve to remember, but actually intentionally committing it to memory. So that when we lose memory, we will still always remember what God has done for us. Because forgetting God, not acknowledging and thanking Him for what He has done, will lead us to be very anxious and to be very fearful and to be very confused when we need to fight new battles. In challenging times, remember the hand of the Lord is powerful, and there will be many, many challenging times ahead. Although we don't want them, they are unwanted, they will come. Remember the hand of the Lord is powerful. So in uncertain times, remember the battle belongs to the Lord. And of course, at all times, good times, difficult times, be grateful that our God is faithful, our God is good, share about His goodness, and always trust and obey Him. And so with that, I will say, let's be like Joshua, be like the priests, be like the 2.5 tribes in our obedience to God, to be able to bring Him and give Him all glory and praise. Thank you.